At Thanksgiving, I saw my husband's betrayal play out in front of everyone. The morning sunlight streamed gently through the kitchen window, casting warm streaks across the wooden floor. I could hear the soft hum of the coffee maker and the faint rustle of leaves outside, a reminder that autumn was at its peak. Everything felt familiar and comforting, the kind of ordinary warmth that always made me feel safe in my own home. I moved slowly, savoring the quiet moments before the whirlwind of Thanksgiving would descend. The smell of cinnamon and roasted pumpkin lingered in the air from yesterday's baking, and it made me smile, thinking of the kids' delight when they woke up to breakfast. I set the table with care, placing the autumn-themed napkins just so, lining the silverware evenly, making sure everything looked perfect. The plates gleamed in the morning light, and I caught my reflection in the polished surface of the table. For a moment, I paused, letting myself feel the satisfaction of simple order. The house was calm, almost too calm, but I shook off the unease that bubbled faintly at the edges of my mind. This was our tradition, our haven, and I didn't want to let a passing worry disrupt it. The kids tumbled down the stairs, their excitement filling the house like a rising tide. I greeted them with hugs and ruffled hair, listening as they chattered endlessly about their plans for the day. I laughed at their stories, though I noticed that little quiver of nervous energy that always came with the chaos of family gatherings. There was an almost imperceptible tension in the air, but I brushed it off. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about love, warmth, and gratitude. And for years, it had been exactly that. I could hear my husband moving in the kitchen, humming a tune I recognized, though slightly off-key. I smiled to myself. He always found small ways to contribute, even if his methods were clumsy. The scent of frying bacon reached me, and I watched him carefully flip the strips, trying not to burn them. There was something about the ordinary domestic rhythm that grounded me, that made the world feel safe and predictable. I believed in this rhythm, in the life we had built together, even if a tiny, nagging worry tugged at the back of my mind. I paused by the doorway, watching him set a plate down for the kids. He caught my eye and gave a quick, affectionate smile, one I had learned to rely on over the years as a signal of shared understanding. My heart lifted slightly, even as the faint tension lingered. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the stress of the season settling in my chest. Still, I noticed the way he glanced at his phone a little too often, the subtle stiffening in his posture when he thought I wasn't looking. Small things, easily explained, or so I told myself. The living room was already filled with the soft, golden glow of the autumn morning. I sank into the couch for a moment, inhaling the faint scent of pine from the garland I had draped along the mantel. The kids' laughter floated up the stairs like music, and for a fleeting second, everything felt perfect. I closed my eyes, feeling the comfort of routine, of family, of love. Yet, even in that perfect moment, there was a whisper of unease, a shadow brushing the edges of my awareness. I shook it off with a deep breath, telling myself that family traditions could feel overwhelming without reason. That anticipation often made the heart anxious. I moved to the pantry to check the ingredients for the pumpkin pie. The jars of spices and bags of flour were neatly arranged, a testament to the quiet care I took in preparing for these moments. My hands lingered on the counter as I ran through the mental checklist. Pies, turkey, stuffing, vegetables. Everything seemed in order, everything predictable. And yet, I could not ignore the tiny feeling that something was slightly different this year, subtle and almost invisible. Stepping back into the main hallway, I listened to the muffled sounds of conversation from upstairs. The house seemed alive, yet I felt slightly removed from it, observing rather than participating, as if I were standing behind a veil. There was love everywhere, thick and tangible, but there was also a hint of fragility, a suggestion that even perfect routines could mask uncertainties. I smiled faintly, reminding myself to focus on gratitude, to enjoy these fleeting moments before the busy day unfolded. I paused by the window, watching the leaves swirl lazily in the breeze. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of smoke from a neighbor's fire. I inhaled deeply, trying to steady the fluttering in my chest. Despite the warmth, the laughter, and the comforting smells, a whisper of apprehension lingered just below the surface. I could not place it, could not name it, and so I let it sit quietly in the back of my mind. Something felt off this year, but I couldn't have known what awaited me. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with a crisp chill, the kind that makes you pull your sweater a little tighter around your shoulders. I moved through the kitchen, setting out serving dishes and arranging utensils while the kids scrambled around in excitement. Their laughter and chatter filled the air, bouncing off the walls and ceiling. Yet underneath it, I felt a strange hollowness, as if something was shifting subtly around me. I shook my head, blaming fatigue and anticipation, telling myself this was normal. My husband appeared in the doorway, holding a mug of coffee, the steam curling upward. He gave me a smile, but it felt fleeting, almost rehearsed. I noticed the way his eyes darted toward his phone on the counter before quickly returning to me. I forced myself not to dwell on it, telling myself I was imagining things. Yet, the sensation of being slightly out of sync with him lingered, a quiet prickle at the base of my neck. I began chopping vegetables for the stuffing, the rhythmic sound of knife against cutting board soothing in its familiarity. The aroma of onions and celery mingled with the faint scent of roasting turkey in the oven. I glanced over at my husband as he moved to check the temperature of the bird, noting the subtle tension in his shoulders. Something about his movements seemed sharper, more deliberate than usual, as if he were hiding something in plain sight. My stomach fluttered uncomfortably, but I dismissed it, telling myself he was simply focused on making everything perfect. The kids ran in and out, carrying trays and napkins, their voices blending into a chorus of excitement. I laughed along with them, but my mind kept wandering back to my husband. He had been distracted lately, more so than usual, and I found myself searching for explanations. Work stress? Forgotten deadlines? Or was it something else entirely? The uncertainty gnawed at me, even as I continued setting the table and arranging the centerpiece with care. At one point, he stepped away, leaving his phone face down on the counter. I couldn't resist a glance, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a string of messages pop up before he quickly snatched it away. I pretended not to notice, focusing on the pie crust I was rolling, but my heart had skipped a beat. A sudden wave of suspicion brushed against the edges of my mind, quiet and unwelcome. I tried to push it down, telling myself that trust was stronger than fleeting unease, yet the sensation lingered like an unwelcome guest. I moved to the living room to check on the decorations, adjusting the garland along the mantel and fluffing the pillows on the couch. My husband followed, offering to help, but he seemed distant, more interested in glancing at his phone than engaging with me. I felt a pang of isolation, as if he were physically present but emotionally elsewhere. I asked a casual question about his plans for the day, and his answer was brief, almost clipped. I try not to read too much into it, yet every detail, the tone, the hesitation, the way he avoided my gaze, added weight to the unease building inside me. As the morning wore on, small, odd behaviors began to accumulate. A text message he received mid-conversation, answered quickly and with an unusual intensity. A quiet sigh when he thought no one was looking. The subtle tension in his jaw when he smiled at me. Each tiny action seemed incongruent with the warmth of our home, and I couldn't shake the growing sense that something was being concealed. It was as though I had stepped into a familiar scene, only to notice that one small detail was slightly out of place, and my mind couldn't look away. The kids ran past me again, trailing bits of laughter and spilled cereal. I caught myself staring at my husband, trying to read him, searching for reassurance in a sea of small inconsistencies. My palms felt slightly clammy, a telltale sign of anxiety I hadn't felt in years. I tried to breathe through it, focusing on carving the turkey, on stirring the gravy, on anything that might distract me from the growing awareness that something was wrong. By late morning, I could no longer ignore the gnawing sense that the day would not unfold as expected. I watched my husband more closely now, noting the tiny slips, the half smiles, the furtive glances. The warmth of the home felt slightly brittle, like a fragile ornament hanging by a thread. I told myself to stay grounded, to rely on routine and familiarity, yet the quiet unease had settled in my chest like a heavy stone, persistent and unrelenting. The aroma of roasted turkey filled the kitchen, rich and savory, mingling with the scent of pumpkin pie. I placed the final dish on the counter and stepped back, letting my hands rest on the edge of the island. I watched my husband from across the room, noting once more the way he fidgeted with his watch, the brief flashes of distraction in his eyes. I swallowed hard, the uncertainty twisting in my stomach, and took a deep breath. I wanted to believe everything was fine. I wanted to hold onto the familiar warmth of family and tradition. But a quiet, insistent voice inside me whispered that this Thanksgiving might not be like any other, and I felt an unshakable tension settling over the day that I couldn't stop thinking about the little things from the past year, the moments I had dismissed as insignificant at the time. It started as a whisper in my mind, a soft questioning that grew louder the more I reflected. I remembered the weekend when he claimed to be working late, yet I had noticed his car in the driveway when I thought he was still at the office. I hadn't said anything then, chalking it up to a mix-up in my memory. But now, the detail pressed against my chest, uncomfortable and insistent. There was the time he missed our anniversary dinner, offering a flimsy excuse about a last-minute meeting. I remembered sitting at the table, candlelight flickering, and feeling a subtle pang of disappointment. I had brushed it off with a laugh, telling myself work was stressful, that he meant well. But now, as I replayed the scene, the unease returned in full force. Something about the way he had avoided my gaze, the stiffness in his smile, seemed to suggest a story he wasn't telling. I thought about the week he suddenly decided to take up running, claiming he wanted to get healthy before the holidays. I had supported him, cheering him on, proud of the effort. But the quietness of those early mornings, the secretive way he left the house, gnawed at me. I remembered the faint sound of his phone vibrating on the kitchen counter, only for him to quickly snatch it up and disappear into the garage. At the time, I had assumed it was just a private work call. Now, those small incidents felt like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was assembling. There were other oddities, small but persistent. The way he would suddenly change the topic when I asked him a simple question about his day, or how he laughed a little too loudly at jokes I didn't quite understand. I remember the day he canceled plans with friends at the last minute, citing exhaustion, yet I had later heard about him being somewhere else entirely. Each memory, once harmless and easily explained, now shimmered with a shadow of doubt. My mind circled them relentlessly, looking for a pattern I didn't want to acknowledge. I went through photographs from the past year, flipping slowly through albums on my phone. There were smiles and happy moments, birthdays and vacations, yet a subtle dissonance had started to emerge. I noticed how he seemed distant in certain pictures, his eyes wandering just slightly off camera. I caught myself examining group shots, noticing how his hand would brush against someone else, lingering perhaps a second too long. My heart started to pound as I realized that maybe I had been ignoring a truth I didn't want to see. Even conversations replayed in my mind with a new, suspicious lens. Words I had accepted at face value now seemed carefully constructed, rehearsed perhaps, designed to placate or mislead. I remembered asking him about his colleagues, casual questions that used to feel harmless, and now each vague answer felt like a deliberate omission. I remembered the fleeting discomfort in his expression when I mentioned family gatherings or upcoming holidays. It was subtle, nearly invisible, but now it stood out sharply, impossible to ignore. I caught myself questioning my own memory, my own perception, but the unease refused to be silenced. I tried to rationalize. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe the stress of preparations was magnifying every minor inconsistency. Yet even as I told myself this, my gut refused to relent. A series of small betrayals seemed to trail behind him like shadows, invisible to the world but increasingly clear to me. I realized with a cold clarity that perhaps I had been seeing the truth in fragments all along, and only now was the picture beginning to form. Even our intimate moments began to feel like puzzles I had misread. His laughter, once so familiar, now carried a weight I couldn't place. His hand, resting casually on mine, seemed less reassuring, more like a calculated gesture. I questioned myself. Had I ignored the signs? Had my trust blinded me? The thought twisted painfully in my chest, a mixture of sorrow and dawning apprehension. It was unsettling to confront the possibility that the life I thought I knew so well might have been partially built on deception. I walked through the rooms of our home, touching familiar surfaces, inhaling scents that used to bring comfort. The softness of the couch, the warm aroma of lingering coffee, the faint scent of candles. They all reminded me of normalcy, of routine, of a love I believed to be steadfast. Yet with each step, I felt the growing tension of uncertainty, the undeniable sense that memories could be deceptive. The more I recalled, the more inconsistencies surfaced, gnawing at my sense of security. By the time I sat back down on the couch, the weight of suspicion had settled heavily over me. I could feel it pressing into my chest, cold and insistent, demanding acknowledgement. My hands trembled slightly as I clasped them together, the past years stretching before me in fragments of doubt. I realized that trust, once given freely, could be fragile, and that perhaps I had been walking blind through subtle betrayals, unaware until now. I stared out the window at the golden leaves swirling in the autumn breeze, feeling a quiet tension building in the heart of my home, one I could no longer ignore. The house was alive with activity as the final preparations for Thanksgiving continued. I moved through the rooms, smoothing tablecloths, adjusting the centerpiece, and inhaling the rich scent of roasting turkey. My husband appeared beside me, perfectly poised, offering smiles and gentle reassurances. To anyone else, he seemed attentive, caring, the ideal partner. I watched him as he laughed with the kids, demonstrating patience and warmth, and I felt a pang of admiration for the way he could create calm amid chaos. Yet underneath the surface, there was a dissonance I couldn't ignore. His charm, so effortless and practiced, now felt like a mask, a performance designed for the benefit of others. I noticed the subtle differences in how he treated me when no one else was looking. A quick glance away, a slight stiffness in his touch, a faint sigh when he thought I wasn't observing. It was almost imperceptible, but by now, I had learned to notice the smallest cues. Each one whispered that something was not right. The kids ran around, trailing laughter and crumbs, and he knelt down to tie shoes, adjust coats, and answer questions with patience that seemed almost exaggerated. I felt a flicker of discomfort at how perfectly he played the role, the contrast between his public self and the private moments that had begun to feel uneasy. The dissonance between who he appeared to be and who he might actually be created a tension I couldn't shake. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to smile, to meet his gaze with warmth, pretending not to feel the quiet disconnect. I noticed the way he navigated conversation with family members, charming, attentive, fully engaged. His voice carried a rhythm of familiarity, laughter punctuating his sentences. I wanted to believe in him completely, to rely on the years of love and trust we had built. But every so often, there was a slip, a brief hesitation, a glance that lingered too long in another direction, a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. I found myself replaying these moments, wondering if I was imagining them or if they were subtle warnings I had finally learned to read. We moved into the dining room together, and I watched him as he pulled out chairs, offered a hand to my mother, smiled at my father. The warmth of his interactions was almost blinding, the perfect image of devotion. Yet my mind, sharper now, noticed the micro moments. The way he lingered just a little too long near my cousin, the subtle shift in tone when he answered my aunt's questions, the slight stiffness in his posture as he adjusted the centerpiece. It was a performance, precise and deliberate, and I felt the weight of recognition settle over me like a stone. As he turned to offer a toast, raising his glass with an easy charm, I felt a pang of both admiration and wariness. He could mask unease or guilt with such finesse. I realized that no one would suspect the cracks beneath. The warmth in his tone, the laughter of the family, even the soft clink of glasses against the polished table. All of it reinforced the illusion of normalcy. I forced a smile, holding my glass tightly, reminding myself to breathe, to focus on gratitude, even as a low hum of suspicion ran beneath the surface. I caught a glimpse of him across the room, speaking to my cousin in what seemed a private exchange, words I couldn't hear, gestures subtle enough to go unnoticed by anyone else. My heart tightened as I noticed the slight downward tilt of his head, the almost imperceptible tension in his hands. I told myself to be calm, to trust, to believe in the life we had built. And yet, the contrast between this public performance and the quiet unease I felt in our private moments could not be ignored. It was as though I were seeing two different people, and the one I thought I knew was slipping away behind a perfectly polished mask. Even as I helped the kids serve plates and poured cranberry sauce onto the dish, I found myself observing him closely. His laughter, his easy banter, even the way he passed the dish with a practiced hand. All of it was meticulous, designed, perfect. But perfection now felt like a warning. The more I watched, the more I realized that charm could conceal intention, and that a smile could hide deceit. The warmth of family surrounded us, but I felt the tension rising like a silent tide, quiet yet insistent, pressing against the edges of my trust. When he finally turned to meet my gaze, offering a soft smile that once would have comforted me, I felt the bittersweet ache of doubt. I wanted to believe in him, to trust that all of this was just the usual holiday chaos. But the subtle contradictions, the micro slips, the tiny hesitations, they had become impossible to ignore. Beneath the laughter and the warmth, beneath the smell of turkey and pumpkin, there was a tension I could not shake. A quiet, persistent whisper that all was not as it seemed. I forced myself to exhale slowly, holding on to the hope that this day, like every other, would still carry the semblance of normalcy. Even if I sensed the mask beneath it, I found myself retreating inward as the day unfolded, carrying a quiet unease that seemed to grow with every passing moment. The house was full of chatter, laughter, and the scent of roasting turkey, yet I felt strangely isolated, like an observer in my own home. Every small movement my husband made caught my attention. The way he laughed a little too loudly, the way his eyes flicked to his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. I told myself to trust, to relax, but the whisper of doubt had begun to root itself firmly in my mind. As I moved between the kitchen and dining room, I replayed each interaction in my mind, examining the details I had once ignored. He smiled warmly at my mother, but there was a stiffness in his posture I hadn't noticed before. He offered the kids a playful nudge, yet I caught a flash of tension in his jaw, a slight tightening that vanished the instant anyone looked. I began to wonder if I was imagining things, if the anxiety I carried had distorted my perception. Still, my instincts whispered that something was off, a subtle warning I could not dismiss. Even in the smallest gestures, I noticed discrepancies. When he poured the gravy, his hand shook ever so slightly, as if he were overcompensating. When he answered a question from my cousin, his tone lingered a fraction longer than necessary, careful, rehearsed. The family laughed and carried on around us, completely unaware of the tension I felt. I envied their oblivion, the ease with which they moved through the day, while I felt my mind hyper-focused on tiny inconsistencies that gnawed at the edges of my peace. I tried to ground myself by focusing on the children. Their excitement was infectious, their chatter full of innocence and anticipation. I smiled as they helped set the table, their sticky little fingers pressing crumbs into napkins. Yet even then, I found my gaze drifting toward my husband, noting every flicker of expression, every subtle glance he exchanged with others. The warmth of family, the smell of fresh-baked pies, the soft light of the late morning sun, all of it felt muted by the growing tension inside me. I wanted to cling to normalcy, to believe that the day would unfold as it always had, yet the quiet doubts refused to fade. At one point, I caught him checking his phone when he thought no one was watching. The screen glowed briefly in the dim corner of the kitchen, and his quick, practiced cover-up sent a jolt of unease through me. I forced myself to breathe steadily, to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest, but the awareness lingered like a shadow over the day. Even ordinary moments, passing the salt, exchanging polite words with my aunt, straightening a napkin, were now tinged with suspicion. Each interaction felt like a test, each gesture a potential clue to something hidden beneath the surface. I tried talking to him casually, asking about his schedule and the little plans he had for later. His answers were clipped, delivered with the same practiced charm that had begun to feel rehearsed. I felt a pang of disappointment, not loud or angry, but sharp in its quiet way. I wanted to believe, wanted to accept his words at face value, but my mind had started piecing together subtle patterns I could no longer ignore. I wondered if I had been blind, if I had overlooked the small signs that now seemed glaring in retrospect. The whispers of doubt followed me into the living room, where I paused by the window to watch the leaves swirl in the crisp autumn air. Even as the sun warmed the room, a chill settled over me. The day, so familiar and comforting in years past, now carried an undertone I couldn't shake. My husband's charm, his attentiveness, his laughter, they all felt layered, a mask carefully maintained for everyone else while leaving a gap only I could sense. The realization pressed against me quietly, persistently, and I felt the first stirrings of fear that the life I believed in might not be as solid as I had always assumed. I caught a glimpse of family members exchanging knowing smiles and quiet glances, subtle interactions I hadn't noticed before. I wondered if they sensed something I didn't, or if my mind was now too attuned to tension to see innocence. Each small gesture, each fleeting glance, felt loaded with meaning, and I found myself questioning not just my husband, but the world around me. The laughter, the clatter of dishes, the smell of roasting turkey, all familiar and comforting, now seemed to highlight the isolation I felt, the doubts gnawing quietly at the edges of my heart. By mid-morning, the tension had become almost tangible. I sat for a moment, holding my hands in my lap, trying to steady the nervous flutter in my chest. The quiet doubts whispered relentlessly, growing louder with each passing minute. I wanted to dismiss them, to immerse myself in the warmth of family and tradition, but I could not. Something had shifted subtly beneath the surface of our home, beneath the smiles and laughter, and I knew that the unease I felt was more than imagination. I exhaled slowly, leaning back and closing my eyes briefly. The love I felt for my family remained. The warmth and comfort of routine still offered solace, but the quiet doubts had taken root. They were subtle, insistent, and impossible to ignore. And as I opened my eyes to see the busy, joyful scene around me, I realized that the day I had anticipated for so long might carry a weight I wasn't yet prepared to face. Thanksgiving dinner finally began, the table heavy with food and the air filled with laughter, chatter, and the rich aroma of roasted turkey and spice pies. I moved between serving dishes, offering plates to the kids, and smiling at family members who gathered around. Everything appeared normal on the surface, warm and familiar. Yet my heart carried a subtle tension that refused to fade. I noticed small shifts in my husband's behavior almost immediately, things I hadn't quite seen before. He laughed at a joke my cousin made, leaning slightly closer than necessary, his hand brushing against hers in a casual, almost imperceptible way. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Family gatherings were messy, physical contact was normal, but a tiny, uncomfortable flutter in my chest warned me otherwise. I watched him more closely, taking in the way he angled his body, the way his eyes flicked to her with a softness that didn't match the way he looked at me. My stomach twisted. The laughter around the table seemed distant, filtered through a haze of rising alarm. I caught myself replaying small interactions from earlier in the day. The furtive glances at his phone, the distracted smiles, the subtle stiffness when I tried to engage him privately. All of it clicked into place like a puzzle I hadn't realized I was assembling. My breath came faster, my chest tightening with a mixture of disbelief and dread. I want to stop watching, to look away, but I couldn't. The sense of betrayal had crept into my awareness, quiet and insistent, demanding recognition. He leaned closer to whisper something, his words lost to the hubbub, but the private intimacy of the gesture was unmistakable. My mind raced, trying to rationalize, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. Yet the flutter of my heart, the cold knot in my stomach, and the sharp ache behind my eyes all told me the truth. I was seeing a betrayal play out right in front of me. The knowledge settled over me like a sudden chill, and I realized that the perfect facade I had trusted was beginning to crumble. I excused myself briefly, stepping into the hallway to steady my breath. The laughter and clatter of dishes from the dining room faded slightly, leaving me with a cold, quiet awareness of what I had witnessed. My hands shook as I pressed them against the wall, trying to slow the pounding of my heart. I told myself to stay calm, to observe, to understand before reacting. Yet the emotional shift was undeniable. The safe, familiar world of our family gathering had changed in an instant, and I could feel the fragile trust one had carried begin to fracture. When I returned to the table, I forced a smile, accepting a plate of stuffing from him as though nothing had happened. But the weight of what I had just seen sat heavily in my chest, a tension I couldn't shake. Every subtle gesture, every private glance replayed in my mind, confirming that the unease I had felt all morning had a basis in reality. My world had shifted quietly but irreversibly, and I knew, deep down, that nothing would feel quite the same again. The room was filled with warmth, love, and family traditions. Yet for me, the atmosphere had changed. The laughter now carried an undertone of dread. The smiles were tinged with uncertainty, and every glance my husband exchanged with anyone but me felt like a small, sharp pang. I carried my plate back to my seat, trying to anchor myself in the familiar, the routine, the comforting smells and sounds. But a new, undeniable awareness had taken root. The first glimpse of betrayal had emerged, and there was no undoing it. After that first glimpse at dinner, I couldn't stop noticing the small things. My husband's movements felt deliberate now, precise in a way that drew attention to the edges of his secrecy. He laughed easily, spoke warmly to family members, and offered help with passing dishes. But each gesture was layered, as if hiding a purpose only he understood. My chest tightened with a mixture of anger and disbelief. How could he maintain this perfect facade while leaving the tiniest clues for someone paying close attention? I noticed a folded napkin that didn't belong to anyone in particular tucked slightly under his plate, angled just so. When he reached for the gravy, his hand brushed against it before quickly retracting. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was I overreacting? Could it be an innocent accident? Yet the memory of his furtive glances earlier in the day and the whispered words I couldn't hear played over and over. A gnawing certainty began to grow that something deliberate was unfolding right before me. Even his body language seemed calculated now. When he leaned in to joke with a cousin, his smile was genuine in appearance, but the subtle shifts, the way he angled his head, the careful timing of his gestures, felt orchestrated. My heart ached in that sharp, tight way that comes from recognition. I could see the evidence of deception, and it was undeniable. Each small act added to a pattern I could no longer ignore. The mask of charm was flawless to everyone else, but to me, it was transparent. I excused myself under the pretense of helping in the kitchen and passed near the living room, while my husband's phone vibrated faintly on the counter. His hand darted over it, shielding the screen with a casual flick, and my stomach sank. I caught a glimpse of a name flashing briefly before it disappeared. Someone I didn't know, someone who didn't belong in our family. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my racing thoughts, but the seed of certainty had taken root. The pieces were no longer isolated. They were connecting into a web I could feel but not yet name. I returned to the table, keeping my composure, passing dishes and pouring drinks as though nothing had shifted. But my mind refused to quiet. Every whispered comment, every shared glance between him and others seemed loaded with hidden meaning. I began mentally cataloging them, replaying each moment like a video on loop. The warmth of family and tradition, the comfort of routine, felt like a fragile layer over a deepening fracture. And the more I observed, the clearer it became. The betrayal wasn't just hinted at, it was woven into the very fabric of the day. At one point, I noticed him leaning slightly toward my cousin again, his hand resting lightly on hers for a moment too long. My pulse quickened as I caught the subtle tilt of his head, the faint smile that reached only half his eyes. He glanced at me as if to reassure himself, and I met his gaze, careful not to react, careful to maintain the illusion that I hadn't noticed. But inside, a storm of emotion churned, hurt, anger, disbelief, and the kind of clarity that comes from realizing a truth you've been half aware of all along. Then I saw it, a small note, just peeking out from under his folded napkin. My breath caught. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there, but my eyes were drawn to it, and the faint outline of handwriting confirmed what I had been suspecting. It wasn't elaborate, it wasn't flamboyant, but it was enough to prove that something had been hidden in plain sight all along. The realization hit me with a cold, unmistakable clarity. He had been deliberate, methodical, careful in hiding pieces of his deception, but careless enough to leave a trace. I sat down slowly, hands folded in my lap, trying to appear calm while my mind raced. Every interaction he had had up to that point now felt like a clue. The whispered words I couldn't hear, the glances he thought were private, the carefully orchestrated charm. They all pointed to the same undeniable conclusion. I felt anger rising, sharp and immediate, but tempered by the quiet resolve that comes with understanding the truth. I was no longer blind to the pattern. By the end of the meal, my awareness had sharpened into a kind of painful clarity. I watched him, noticing the subtle ways he attempted to cover tracks, the brief hesitations that betrayed his careful performance. And while everyone else was caught up in the warmth of family and tradition, I could see the web of deceit in its entirety, or at least the parts he hadn't yet perfected. The quiet proof, small and undeniable, had shifted my perspective. I understood now that the betrayal was real, deliberate, and closer than I had ever feared. Sitting there, amidst the chatter and laughter, I felt the mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief settle into a controlled, simmering intensity. I knew that this day, seemingly ordinary and full of warmth, had revealed something extraordinary in its gravity. The betrayal, once hidden, was now partially visible, and it was impossible to ignore. I took a slow, steadying breath, letting myself accept that the pieces were there, waiting for me to put them together. And as I did, I felt a quiet, resolute determination forming. A sense that I would uncover the full truth, piece by piece, without letting the mask of perfection fool anyone else, or myself. I could feel the weight of what I had discovered pressing down on me as the day wore on. Every smile my husband offered, every casual gesture, felt like a performance layered over something I could no longer ignore. My mind raced with questions, with fragments of evidence that I had pieced together over the morning. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers and tear away the mask he had been wearing so flawlessly. But another part of me, sharper now and more deliberate, knew that acting in the heat of the moment would accomplish nothing. I excused myself to the kitchen, keeping my hands busy with clearing dishes and wiping counters, but my thoughts refused to settle. The note I had glimpsed earlier, the furtive glances, the private gestures, they all replayed vividly in my mind. I felt a tightness in my chest, the familiar sting of betrayal, mixed with the urgency to know the full truth. My stomach twisted as I imagined confronting him at the table, the potential chaos, the hurt it could cause the family. I realized that patience would serve me better. I needed clarity before confrontation. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, passing gravy and smiling at relatives. And the contrast between his public charm and the private truths I had begun to notice felt almost surreal. He was flawless to everyone else, an image of warmth and attentiveness. But I could see the cracks now, subtle and revealing. Every slight hesitation, every whispered tone, became magnified under my scrutiny. My resolve hardened. I would not give him the opportunity to manipulate the situation further. I would observe, I would collect, I would understand fully before I acted. The rest of the family was absorbed in their own conversations, laughing and exchanging stories, completely unaware of the tension brewing beneath the surface. I moved among them carefully, maintaining the illusion of normalcy while keeping a close eye on my husband. Each movement he made, each interaction, became part of a mental catalog, a record I was building in real time. I noted how he leaned toward certain family members, the timing of his gestures, the slight inconsistencies in his attention. It was exhausting, watching someone I had trusted so completely while simultaneously analyzing every micro-behavior for signs of deception. At one point, I saw him glance at his phone under the table, subtly angling it so no one else could see. My hands clenched momentarily at my sides. I wanted to reach over, snatch it from him, and demand the truth, but I held back. I had learned that confrontation in the heat of emotion could cloud judgment. I needed proof, a full understanding before making any move. The desire for immediate reaction battled with the necessity of patience, and I forced myself to step back, to breathe, to observe. I found a quiet moment by the window, watching leaves swirl in the chilly autumn air outside. The familiar sights and sounds of our home, the scent of turkey, the laughter of my children, the warmth of the kitchen light, felt muted against the sharp awareness of what I suspected. My chest ached with the effort of maintaining composure, of pretending everything was normal while my mind cataloged every irregularity. Yet the clarity that came with observation was empowering. I was no longer blind. I could see patterns, detect subtleties, and begin to understand the true depth of the situation. Returning to the dining room, I reminded myself to appear engaged and cheerful, passing dishes and smiling at family members as though the tension in my mind didn't exist. My husband met my gaze several times, offering casual smiles that now seemed practiced, almost performative. I forced myself to respond naturally, hiding the storm of emotion inside. Each interaction became a delicate balancing act, maintaining the outward appearance of harmony while silently collecting evidence. It was exhausting but necessary. As the meal continued, I noticed the smallest gestures, how he positioned himself in relation to others, the slight hesitation before responding to questions, the way he occasionally glanced at his phone without alerting anyone. Each observation confirmed what I had begun to suspect. There was more beneath the surface than even I had realized. And yet, I resisted the urge to confront him, to demand immediate answers. I knew that my control over the situation depended on patience, on gathering the full picture before making any move. By the time dessert was served, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The quiet tension I had carried all morning had sharpened into a controlled vigilance. I was no longer reacting impulsively. I was observing deliberately. Every slip, every glance, every minor inconsistency became part of a larger pattern I was now piecing together. I had deferred confrontation, but not out of fear or indecision. I had deferred it out of strategy, a calculated choice to protect myself and ensure the truth would become undeniable. Sitting back in my chair, fork in hand, I exhaled slowly, letting the tension settle on my shoulders. I looked across the table at him, so poised, so charming, and I realized that the battle ahead would not be one of immediate confrontation. It would be a careful, deliberate unraveling, a measured exposure of the truth. I felt the mix of heartbreak, anger, and resolve settle inside me. The confrontation would come, but only when I had the clarity, the proof, and the power to ensure the full truth could no longer be hidden. The tension had been building all morning, but I wasn't fully prepared for the moment when it would finally step out of the shadows and into plain sight. Thanksgiving continued around us, the room full of warmth, laughter, and a familiar aroma of roasted turkey and sweet pies. Everyone else seemed oblivious to the undercurrent, wrapped in the comfort of family tradition. But I had been watching, waiting, piecing together the pattern of subtle betrayals, and suddenly, it became impossible to ignore. It started with a glance, one so brief I almost questioned my perception. My husband leaned slightly toward my cousin as she passed the dish, and for the first time, he didn't hide the intimacy in his gesture. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and the small smile he offered wasn't the casual warmth he gave the rest of the table. It was private, secretive, deliberate. My heart seized in my chest. I felt a hot, twisting surge of disbelief, followed immediately by the icy prick of humiliation. How could this happen here now, in front of everyone I loved? I froze for a moment, my fork hovering over my plate. The laughter and chatter of the family felt distant, muffled, as though I were underwater. I replayed the gestures in my mind. The slight lean, the half smile, the careful timing. It was unmistakable. I had finally seen the betrayal in full view, undeniable, and I couldn't unsee it. My stomach churned, and my hands tightened around my utensils. I wanted to speak, to confront, to demand an explanation, but the awareness that everyone else was oblivious held me back. I had to maintain composure, at least for now. He continued the conversation, his tone warm and light, yet now I could see the cracks in his perfect public facade. The gestures he made toward me were the same I had always trusted, but contrasted sharply with the private attention he gave her. It was deliberate, orchestrated, and painfully clear. I felt a deep, aching shock ripple through me, the kind that settles in your chest and refuses to be ignored. It wasn't just subtle hints anymore. It was right there, undeniable, playing out like a scene I had always feared existed. The moment stretched, each passing second amplifying the emotional impact. I noticed small details I had never paid attention to before. The way his shoulders relaxed only when she was near, the tilt of his head when he listened to her, the faint warmth in his eyes. My mind raced, cataloging each gesture, each micro-expression. The betrayal was no longer hypothetical. It was tangible, real, and it hit harder for being so visible to me alone. Everyone else laughed and chatted around the table, oblivious to the private intimacy unfolding in plain sight. I swallowed hard, forcing my jaw to unclench, telling myself to breathe and observe. Anger, humiliation, and disbelief mingled inside me, each emotion sharpening the edge of the next. My hands trembled slightly as I set down my fork, and yet I forced myself to remain composed. I could not afford a scene, not here, not with family watching. The betrayal was mine to witness, mine to process, and I knew that acting impulsively would only give him the chance to conceal it further. As he handed her the cranberry sauce, their fingers brushed again, this time longer, deliberate. I felt my chest tighten painfully, the ache deepening with each small, controlled gesture. I had seen enough to know that this wasn't accidental, wasn't a misread social cue. The emotional weight of the moment settled over me like a heavy cloak. My trust, carefully built over years, felt like it had been ripped away, leaving only the raw sting of realization. The perfect Thanksgiving I had envisioned was gone, replaced by a private betrayal that everyone else would remain unaware of. I studied his face as he laughed at her joke, and the faint slip, the tilt of his head, the softness in his eyes, confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. It was impossible to ignore now. My mind raced through the morning, connecting every furtive glance, every whispered tone, every private gesture. The pieces of the puzzle had finally aligned, and the truth was both devastating and undeniable. My stomach churned, my heart pounded, and a cold ache of humiliation spread through me. Even as dessert was brought to the table, I kept my eyes on him. The warmth of family, the bright chatter, the sense of baked goods, all of it existed in the background, while my focus was sharp, unrelenting. I could see him for what he truly was in that moment, and it shattered something deep within me. The betrayal wasn't hidden anymore. It was fully, unmistakably in view, unfolding in front of my eyes, and I was powerless to stop it without careful planning. By the time the plates were cleared, I had steeled myself, holding on to the resolve that this exposure, though painful, would not break me completely. The betrayal had been revealed, undeniable, right in front of everyone, and I understood with a chilling clarity that the path forward required patience, observation, and measured action. The storm had arrived, and I had seen it in full. After the betrayal revealed itself so clearly, I felt the floor beneath me shift, like the solid ground of my life had become something uncertain, unstable. I tried to focus on the family around me, the laughter of the children, the casual chatter, but it all felt muted, distant, as though I were watching from behind a thick glass. The warmth of the room, the familiar scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon, could not reach me. My heart pounded, my chest tight, and a cold, restless ache began to settle deep inside. I replayed the moment over and over in my mind, the subtle gestures, the private glances, the fleeting smiles that now carried a weight I could not ignore. The emotional spiral was immediate. Disbelief, shock, humiliation, and then a sharp undercurrent of anger that made my hands clench unconsciously. I tried to steady my breathing, to anchor myself in something familiar, but the thoughts kept circling relentlessly. Every tiny detail, every whisper, every glance I had ignored or rationalized now stood out as undeniable proof of a pattern I'd been blind to. I found myself questioning everything. The life we had built, the trust one had given freely, the years of shared memories. Was it all a lie? Had I misread him entirely? My chest ached with grief as I realized that even the moments I had cherished privately might now be tainted. Recollections filtered through a mask he had maintained so carefully. I wanted to cry, to shout, to demand answers, but the awareness that our family was present kept me silent. I could not allow him to see. The raw pain, not yet. I had to hold it together. Even mundane actions became colored by suspicion. When he reached for the gravy, I felt a pang of anger. When he passed the plate to a cousin, my stomach twisted. I noticed the smallest shifts in tone, the barely perceptible hesitation in his words, and the subtle warmth reserved only for her. It was exhausting, the constant vigilance, the emotional toll of watching someone I loved commit betrayal in plain sight. I felt my body tense, my muscles stiff, and a restless energy surged through me, as if my mind were racing faster than my ability to process it fully. I retreated briefly to the kitchen, needing a moment of solitude, and ran my hands under the cold faucet, letting the water wash over them. The simple sensation grounded me slightly, but it did little to calm the storm raging in my chest. Anger, heartbreak, disbelief, and a creeping sense of paranoia swirled together, making it impossible to focus. I kept thinking of all the small signs I had ignored, the moments I had rationalized, the subtle shifts in his behavior that had now revealed themselves as part of a pattern. The realization was suffocating. I returned to the dining room, forcing myself to smile and participate in the conversation, but each laugh, each casual exchange, felt like a reminder of what I had seen. The emotional spiral deepened as I noticed how effortlessly he returned to charm mode, interacting with family as though nothing had happened. I felt a surge of bitterness. How could he move so seamlessly while I carried the weight of the truth in my chest? My mind cataloged every slip, every glance, every gesture, assembling the pieces into a picture of long-term deceit that I was only beginning to grasp fully. I began to question myself, wondering if I had overlooked earlier signs, if my trust had made me naive, if I had ignored warnings that were always there. Self-doubt gnawed at me, feeding the spiral of emotion that refused to subside. The love I had felt for him, the warmth of our home, all seemed tinged now with uncertainty. I felt both powerless and hyper-aware, a combination that left me simultaneously exhausted and alert. Every interaction, every movement, every glance became a potential clue, a signal to watch, to interpret, to catalog. Even the children's laughter, once a comfort, now seemed to echo in a space I no longer fully inhabited. I felt a quiet isolation, a detachment, as if the betrayal had created an invisible wall between me and the world I had trusted. The spiral of emotions continued, looping back on itself. Shock gave way to anger, anger to fear, fear to grief, and grief to a simmering determination. I realized that while the betrayal had shattered the calm of the day, it had also awakened a vigilance I had not known I possessed. By the time the meal ended and the dishes were cleared, I felt emotionally drained, yet there was a subtle clarity beneath the exhaustion. The spiral of emotion had carried me through disbelief, humiliation, and heartbreak, but had also sharpened my perception. I could see the patterns, recognize the subtleties, and understand the depth of the deception. The realization settled over me. This was bigger than a single gesture, a fleeting glance, or an isolated act. The betrayal was part of a longer, more intricate pattern that I was only beginning to uncover. I took a slow, measured breath, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on me. The emotional spiral had left its mark, raw and unrelenting, but it had also strengthened my resolve. I knew that patience, observation, and deliberate action would be necessary to navigate the path ahead. The clarity that emerged from the chaos of emotion was faint but undeniable. I would not be blinded by pain, and I would not ignore the truth. I had seen the first layers of betrayal, and now I was ready to dig deeper, to uncover the full extent of what had been hidden. The following hours were a blur of observation and quiet calculation. As I pieced together the events of the day, a growing sense of dread settled deep in my chest. What had begun as fleeting unease had now evolved into a painful, undeniable understanding. My husband's betrayal ran far deeper than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just a single glance, a whispered word, or a careless gesture. It was a pattern, deliberate and layered, touching aspects of our life I had taken for granted. I started noticing details I had never paid attention to before. Receipts tucked in drawers, vague explanations for sudden expenses, the way he spent time alone in his study or on his phone. My chest tightened with each discovery, each new piece of evidence adding weight to the picture forming in my mind. I felt a strange mixture of heartbreak and clarity. The truth was painful, yet seeing it fully allowed me to stop questioning myself. The betrayal wasn't imagined. It was real, concrete, and impossible to dismiss. Even small interactions confirmed what I had begun to suspect. A fleeting smile, a carefully placed word, a hushed tone. I could see the signs both publicly and privately. My mind cataloged everything, connecting each incident into a narrative I had been blind to for months, perhaps even longer. The realization hit harder because of our shared history. The years of trust and love that I had assumed were unshakable. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a mix of grief and outrage that made my hands tremble. As I observed him more closely, I began to uncover the emotional depth of his deception. He wasn't simply careless. He had actively hidden parts of his life, manipulating perceptions with a precision that was almost frightening. The charm, the attentiveness, the public displays of love, they were all a carefully maintained facade. Every laugh, every gentle touch, every reassurance had been layered over something hidden, leaving me with the chilling awareness that my trust had been exploited with intent. I noticed the way he reacted to certain questions, the subtle defensiveness that had once seemed inconsequential. Words that had seemed casual or incidental now carried hidden meaning, revealing patterns of avoidance and concealment. I saw evidence in financial discrepancies, unexplained absences, and repeated instances of secrecy that he had carefully crafted over time. Each discovery intensified the emotional storm inside me, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and the sorrow of realizing that the foundation of our life together was compromised. The realization that the deception touched multiple areas of our life was staggering. It wasn't just personal, it extended to finances, relationships, and emotional intimacy. I felt the weight of it pressing on me, cold and relentless. Yet with the awareness came a strange, controlled clarity. I could see the patterns, identify the methods, and recognize the ways in which he had attempted to maintain appearances while hiding critical truths. The betrayal was bigger than I had feared, but for the first time, I could understand its scope. In quiet moments, I replayed interactions in my mind, noticing how others had unknowingly confirmed pieces of the truth. A knowing glance from a family member, an oddly timed remark from a friend, the subtle tension in casual conversations, all pointed to the same conclusion. My husband's deception was layered, intricate, and deliberate. The anger and hurt I felt were tempered by the realization that I now had the clarity to see it fully. I no longer had to guess or imagine. The patterns were visible, undeniable. Even observing him in casual moments reinforced what I had begun to understand. His laughter with others, the ease with which he maintained his charm, the careful management of his image. It all contrasted sharply with the hidden reality I had glimpsed. My heart ached, but beneath the pain, a quiet determination began to form. I was no longer naive. I could see through the performance, recognize the manipulations, and begin to plan my next steps with a precision he could not anticipate. By the evening, the emotional weight of the day had settled over me like a dense fog. I felt exhausted, yet alert, devastated yet resolute. I realized that the betrayal had been profound, layered, and intentional, but I was no longer powerless. I could see the truth clearly, catalog every detail, and begin to reclaim control over a life that had been subtly undermined. The ache in my chest remained, but it was now paired with a quiet, simmering resolve. I understood the depth of the deception, and with that understanding came a sense of control I had not felt since the first subtle hints had appeared months ago. Sitting quietly in the living room, I allowed myself a moment of breath. The warmth of family life, the lingering scent of food and candles, the soft murmur of conversation, all of it existed alongside a stark, undeniable truth. The man I had trusted had betrayed me in ways I was only beginning to fully comprehend. The despair was sharp, but so was the clarity, and beneath it, a quiet determination began to take hold. I would not react blindly. I would not allow this to continue unnoticed. I would see the full truth and take measured, intelligent action. I thought I had seen it all. That the betrayal I had uncovered was the full story, that the evidence I had pieced together was the worst I would discover. But as the day turned into evening and the house settled into a quieter rhythm, a new, shocking layer began to reveal itself. Something I hadn't anticipated, something far more complex, started to emerge, twisting everything I thought I knew into an entirely new reality. It began with a casual comment from a family member, one that I had dismissed at first, but now struck with uncanny significance. The words were light, almost playful, yet the undertone was unmistakable. I paused mid-step, feeling a shiver run down my spine. Could it be possible? Could the web of deceit extend beyond him, beyond the private gestures I had witnessed? My mind raced, revisiting the day's earlier events with a sharper, more suspicious lens. Each interaction took on a new meaning, every subtle glance or whispered word potentially part of a larger, unseen plan. I began retracing the evidence I had already observed, the glances, the secret notes, the fleeting smiles, and all the tiny inconsistencies in behavior. Each piece that had seemed isolated before now fit into a broader, more unsettling pattern. I realized that his betrayal was no longer just personal. It was entangled with other people, their actions indirectly shaping the situation in ways I had never imagined. The emotional impact hit me with full force. Shock, grief, and disbelief collided with the simmering anger that had been building all day. It wasn't just that he had deceived me. It was that the deception involved others, perhaps without their knowledge, but in ways that had directly affected our lives. The realization made my chest tighten, my stomach churn, and my hands tremble slightly. It was as if the rug had been pulled from under me all over again, and I was left standing in a room I no longer recognized. I felt disoriented, betrayed on multiple levels, and the sense of trust one had relied upon crumbled further. I noticed subtle signals I had overlooked earlier, the way certain relatives avoided direct eye contact, the timing of hushed conversations, and fleeting expressions that didn't match the words spoken. The idea that others had unknowingly contributed to the betrayal twisted my understanding of the day. It was no longer simply a matter of his private actions. The network of deceit was broader, more layered, and far more insidious than I could have anticipated. My mind raced to comprehend the full scope. At first, I felt paralyzed by the shock, unsure how to process the revelation. How could the betrayal be so intricately woven, involving not just one person, but perhaps multiple threads I hadn't yet traced? I sat quietly, letting the implications sink in, the room around me blurred by a mixture of grief and disbelief. My mind ran through possible scenarios, trying to identify who might have unknowingly assisted, who had contributed to the deception without realizing it, and what the ultimate consequences might be. The magnitude was overwhelming. The twist cut deeper because it reframed my perception of every interaction I had witnessed that day. The gestures that had once seemed personal now carried echoes of a broader manipulation. The small notes, the furtive glances, the whispered words. They were no longer isolated betrayals. They were part of a complex pattern I had barely begun to map. My emotional state shifted from raw heartbreak to a mix of shock and grim determination. I knew I had to see the entire picture before taking any action. I felt anger surge again, hotter and more focused this time. It wasn't just at him anymore. It was at the realization that the trust one had placed in others, knowingly or unknowingly, had been manipulated. But beneath that anger, a careful resolve began to form. I would not allow this revelation to scatter my thoughts into chaos. I needed clarity, I needed evidence, and I needed strategy. Emotional reaction without precision could only make matters worse. As the evening deepened, I took deliberate steps to gather my thoughts and confirm the pattern. I began connecting interactions, noting discrepancies, and mentally cataloging all the moments that now seemed linked. The betrayal was no longer a simple personal matter. It was multi-layered, involving more than just him, and potentially implicating others who had been caught in the orbit of his deceit. Yet, for the first time, I felt a sense of control return. I would uncover the full truth, and I would do so intelligently, not impulsively. By the time the night settled into quiet, I understood the gravity of what I faced. The twist nobody saw coming had revealed itself. The betrayal was far more layered, more calculated, and more interconnected than I had imagined. My shock remained, but it was tempered by clarity. I would need patience, strategy, and careful planning. The stage was set for deliberate action, and though the heartbreak ran deep, I felt a quiet determination hardening within me. I would not be blindsided again. I knew it was time to confront the evidence. But I approached it carefully, like handling a fragile object that could shatter at the slightest wrong move. I didn't rush, and I didn't speak. Instead, I gathered every piece of proof I had uncovered over the day. The secret notes, the furtive glances I'd cataloged, the inconsistencies in behavior, and the subtle, undeniable signs of deception. I spread them out in front of me, arranging them in a way that allowed me to see the full pattern clearly. Each piece carried its own weight, but together they formed a picture that could no longer be ignored or rationalized. I started with the notes, small slips of paper that had been tucked and hidden, some written hastily, others carefully planned. The words, the handwriting, the subtle timing, they all confirmed what my intuition had screamed from the moment I glimpsed them. I traced each one with my fingers, reading them over and over until the full meaning sank in. A cold clarity settled over me, sharp and precise, cutting through the emotional fog I had carried for hours. I wasn't imagining it. This was real. Next, I revisited my mental catalog of glances, gestures, and whispers. I played each interaction in my mind like a silent film, noting the timing, the expressions, and the subtle context. The private smile, the fleeting touch, the way his tone shifted ever so slightly when speaking to certain people. All of it now fit perfectly into the narrative I had constructed. The emotional release was immediate. Anger tempered by understanding, grief softened by control, disbelief transformed into clarity. For the first time, I felt the beginnings of empowerment. I pulled out the receipts and financial discrepancies I had noticed over the past weeks, documents I had previously brushed off as minor errors or coincidences. Now, in the context of the other evidence, they became pieces of the larger puzzle. I could see the full extent of his manipulation, the way he had hidden aspects of his life from me, the careful layering of deceit. Each new revelation deepened the ache in my chest, but it also sharpened my resolve. The truth was now undeniable, and I could face it without fear of being wrong. One was intentional, signaling to him that I was no longer passive, no longer oblivious to the extent of his deception. My restraint became a form of power, the quiet knowledge that I had control where he had assumed secrecy. Observing his behavior in response was telling. For the first time, I noticed hesitation in his movements, slight pauses in conversation, and subtle recalibrations of charm. He was testing boundaries, probing for weakness, and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the trust he had taken for granted was gone. And I did not have to speak to make him aware. My controlled demeanor, the careful management of interactions, and the quiet, unwavering observation were enough. The silent consequences were more piercing than any outburst could have been. I began to withdraw trust in measured ways. I shared less information, asked fewer questions, and kept certain parts of my life deliberately separate. Each withdrawal was purposeful, creating a buffer between us and signaling that access and intimacy were no longer automatic. He responded with subtle anxiety, small slips of tension that confirmed he understood the shift. It was a powerful reminder that the most effective revenge was not about chaos or confrontation. It was about reclaiming autonomy while allowing the consequences to unfold naturally. I also allowed the truth to reveal itself to others indirectly. Without gossiping or dramatizing, I ensured that moments of inconsistency or evidence of his behavior were visible to those who had previously been unaware. I did not interfere or manipulate outcomes. I simply maintained transparency in my own actions and interactions. Slowly, the fallout began to ripple outward, leaving him to face the consequences of choices he had believed hidden. Observing this quietly, without commentary, gave me a deep satisfaction that words could never achieve. Through it all, I maintained my composure. I did not yell, I did not threaten, and I did not allow anger to dictate behavior. Instead, I embraced the power of calculated observation, deliberate restraint, and controlled distance. I noticed his small missteps, the nervous glances, the careful phrasing of words, all evidence that my measured actions were effective. Each moment confirmed that the quiet approach, patient, intelligent, deliberate, was far more potent than confrontation could ever be. I focused on my own life, my own family, and the spaces where I could find stability and comfort. The children's laughter, the warmth of familiar routines, and the simple pleasure of moments untainted by betrayal became anchors. I allowed myself to heal while simultaneously letting the consequences of his choices unfold naturally. The contrast between my calm confidence and his growing unease was a quiet, visceral satisfaction, a confirmation that the balance of power had shifted. At times, I reflected on what this quiet revenge truly meant. It was not cruelty, and it was not malice. It was intelligence, patience, and dignity. It was a reclamation of control over my own life, a demonstration that betrayal could not dominate or define me. The actions I took were subtle, almost invisible, yet they had profound impact. I felt a sense of empowerment that came not from dramatic confrontation, but from measured, thoughtful strategy that left no room for denial. Even as days passed, the effects of quiet, deliberate action became clearer. Relationships shifted, patterns that had once been taken for granted now changed, and he began to experience the fallout of his choices in ways he could not manipulate or control. I remained poised, calm, and observant, a steady presence in the midst of the consequences. Each subtle shift confirmed the power of restraint and intelligence in responding to betrayal. By the end of this period, I felt the deep satisfaction of having reclaimed my life, autonomy, and dignity. The betrayal, once raw and overwhelming, had been addressed in a way that preserved my integrity while allowing him to face the results of his own actions. The quiet revenge was complete, not through shouting or confrontation, but through measured, deliberate, and thoughtful action. I had turned heartbreak into strategy, pain into clarity, and betrayal into empowerment. After the quiet revenge had unfolded, the house finally settled into a sense of balance I hadn't felt in months. The tension that had weighed so heavily on my chest was replaced by a controlled calm, a quiet assurance that I had reclaimed the life and dignity that betrayal had threatened to steal. The days of watching, cataloging, and quietly guiding the consequences were behind me, and I could finally take a breath that wasn't laced with suspicion or heartbreak. I reflected on everything that had happened: the betrayal, the lies, the hidden gestures, and the orchestrated charm that had masked a deeper deception. At first, it was hard to separate the pain from the lessons, but gradually I saw the clarity in each moment. Trust is fragile, and even the most loving relationships can conceal truths we are unwilling to see. But I also learned that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, not necessarily with the same people, but within ourselves through self-awareness, boundaries, and resilience. The heartbreak was still there, sharp in certain moments, like a faint echo that reminded me of what had been lost. Yet alongside that sorrow was strength, a fortified understanding of myself and what I would and would not allow. I realized that resilience doesn't come from ignoring pain or pretending it didn't happen. It comes from facing it, understanding it, and using it to build a foundation that cannot be easily shaken. The betrayal had been a harsh teacher, but its lessons were invaluable. Family dynamics shifted in subtle ways. Some relationships became closer as trust and honesty took on new weight. Others required distance and careful boundaries. I found myself navigating these changes with a sense of clarity I hadn't possessed before. I no longer assumed that loyalty or love were guarantees. Instead, I approached each connection with both warmth and discernment. It was a delicate balance, but one that allowed me to preserve relationships while protecting myself from future harm. I also found a renewed appreciation for the small, grounding moments in life. The laughter of children, the quiet routine of meals shared without tension, the ordinary acts of kindness that had once seemed mundane. These moments reminded me that life continues, even after betrayal, and that joy and normalcy are still possible. I embraced them deliberately, savoring each one, knowing that I had earned the right to reclaim happiness on my own terms. The process of moving forward wasn't linear. Some days, memories of the betrayal would surge unexpectedly, and I would feel the old ache in my chest. But I no longer allowed those moments to define me or dictate my reactions. Instead, I used them as markers, reminders of the lessons I had learned, to trust wisely, to observe carefully, and to act with intelligence rather than impulse. Each pang of memory became a prompt to reaffirm boundaries and maintain clarity, rather than a source of despair. I also noticed a profound change within myself. I had learned patience, the power of quiet observation, and the strength in deliberate, measured action. I realized that I didn't need to wield anger or confrontation as weapons. Control, clarity, and dignity could accomplish far more. The empowerment that grew from this understanding was steady and enduring, a foundation that would support me in every future relationship and challenge. As weeks turned into months, the rhythm of life returned, steadier and more intentional than before. I found joy in familiar routines and in the creation of new memories that were untainted by the shadow of betrayal. I remained cautious, naturally, but not paranoid. The scars remained, reminders of the past, but they no longer dictated my choices or my sense of self. I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of navigating the complexities of trust, love, and human relationships. Looking back, I understood that the betrayal, though devastating, had been a turning point. It forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, to assess the foundations of trust, and to develop the emotional tools needed to reclaim control. The lessons I had learned about resilience, boundaries, and discernment would guide me in all aspects of life. I was no longer merely a victim of circumstance. I had become a careful, intelligent observer and a deliberate actor in my own story. In the quiet of the evening, sitting with my family and savoring the ordinary comforts of home, I felt a profound sense of closure. The heartbreak remained, but it was tempered by strength and clarity. I had learned that trust must be earned and maintained, that deception can be hidden even in the most familiar spaces, and that the true measure of resilience is not in avoiding pain, but in responding to it with wisdom. I had moved forward, wiser, stronger, and cautiously hopeful for the future.